This is Proxy Countdown. Welcome to the big show for the week of May 12th, 2025, alongside my tag team partner, Matt Moscardi. I'm Damian Rollis. On today's countdown, the Pope steps down at Berkshire Hathaway while a knight leaves embattled United Health Group. Some chicken fingers nepotism at Tyson Foods. A finger-licking good board fight at Kohls. A very small handful of shareholder victories at 89 large cap meetings. And on the big vote, Matt looks at my cell phone carrier, Verizon Communications. We'll start with our top stories. We got a lot of them this week. United Health Group CEO, Sir Andrew Whitty, has resigned 6 months after United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson was murdered in New York City. In his place, former CEO and current executive chair Steve Hemsley will boomerang back into a role he originally vacated in 2017. Steve will receive a golden hello again, consisting of a one-time $60 million option award. Now, while the company claims there will be no additional annual equity awards during the first 3 years of Steve's employment, there are no performance hurdles tied to this award, meaning Steve could make a boatload of cash even if the stock market just goes up, independent of his work as CEO.
Talk about a boomerang.
Yeah, that's a healthy, rich boomerang. Lots of news at Kohl's. This one's exhausting. First, CEO Ashley Buchanan was terminated after an internal probe found that he directed business to a vendor tied to his romantic partner. The vendor received favorable terms in a multimillion-dollar consulting deal, which directly violated Kohl's conflict of interest policy. So he was forced to step down and also forced to forfeit his equity awards. And he must repay part of his $2.5 million signing bonus. That's the first bit of news at Kohls, which is already crazy. They're on their fourth CEO in 3 years. Yeah, Matt.
Well, this is their second CEO in 5 months.
Yeah, he took over in January, right?
January was when he started. I believe the total signing bonus was $3 million. And he has to pay back $2.5 million of the $3 million because he didn't even make it to the end of the year or something like that. But the nuts part of this is who's choosing the CEOs?
Well, yeah, let me get to that. The man in charge of the board now is a man named Michael Bender, and the board in itself has been in place for years. So having said that, let's get to the next part of the Kohl story, which is sort of connected and sort of not connected all at the same time, which is weird. Kohl's director and compensation committee chair, Christine Day, resigned from the board on May 5th, 2025. Kohls initially claimed that her decision was not due to any disagreements with the company or any
that was in
matter,
a filing. Yeah, that was
in the filing,
yeah.
Or any matter relating to the company's operations, policies, or practices. Then Day sent an email, which was included in a subsequent amendment to that filing, saying, these are her words. "I want to stress my concern that this is an inappropriate way to handle this. All shareholders deserve the same access to the same information, and for us not to respond to ISS is not good governance. In the 8K filing for my departure, it would not be accurate to say I have no disagreements with the board. Unfortunately, I have been continually disappointed with the level of governance process. The 8K needs to reflect this." That's her first email. Then she goes on in several other emails to point out some of her concerns and also to say what she was saying about ISS, which is kind of vague in that first email. She says there is now she's calling out specifically board chair Michael Bender, saying there is no delegation to committees or chairs. Michael handles everything, maybe speaks to one person or two, then tells everyone what the decision is. Some people know more than others, leading to board members feeling alienated, out of the loop, and worse, developing a culture where real discussions rarely occur. Now, Matt, her main beef seems to be that ISS called out the pay practices at Kohls, recommended a vote against, And Kohls, the board, did not respond to ISS. Now, she was the chair of the compensation committee, and I guess she was clearly upset at Chair Michael Bender for not letting her respond. I guess it runs through the chair, but that's the weird sort of fallout of her resignation. Now, before you comment, I want to tell you that shareholders had a chance to kind of weigh in on all of this. Yesterday, Matt, May 14th, was actually Kohl's annual meeting. Only 5% of Kohl's shareholders said no to board chair Michael Bender, so they're not mad at him. Yet 45% said no on pay, because remember, ISS recommended a vote against, while the average director support was 92% yes. So,
well, look,
investors are happy with the board, but yeah, go ahead, Matt.
There was no activist involved here, which means no one actually looked at the board members to see whether or not...
Including ISS, which had a chance to weigh in here because they did look at pay.
Well, whose pay are they rejecting? Because the guy whose pay they're rejecting just quit.
It's weird because again, we pointed out that fourth CEO in 3 years. You said, the third CEO in
second
6 months.
In like 6 months.
Well, really the third because, right?
Yes, correct.
And yet ISS didn't weigh in all of that. In fact, again, all of the board received average support of at least 92%. So, and as I pointed out, this board has been in place for years. So the board is clearly not to blame for any of this.
So the committee chair who sets the pay wasn't allowed to talk to ISS about the pay because her email implies that Michael Bender, who's the now chair of the board, wouldn't let her because he, quote, handles everything.
Right.
And she wasn't basically allowed to talk to ISS. She resigns in protest. ISS, the remaining committee members do not get votes against. The pay for a guy who left gets votes against of 45%, but that guy doesn't exist anymore. And the rest of the board, including the nominating committee and nominating committee chair, are wildly approved despite having 3 CEOs in 6 months' time.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Investors, are you reading any of the filings?
Yeah. Not to mention a very public fight that makes Kohls look even worse.
It wasn't like this one was just snuck in an 8K somewhere. This one was reported on by the business news. This one was out there and you could find it. This actually is one of the most telling stories so far this year.
Let this be a perfect use case
of how investors are not actually paying that close attention.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. What's remarkable is that they let ISS determine how they vote on pay, and they also let ISS determine how they vote on directors, and ISS is not paying attention to the board. That's my takeaway. Moving on, there's actually more, Matt.
Oh, geez.
How about this one, where investors don't really have a say, but it's still a great, crazy story. Tyson Foods named the chicken wings of board chair John H. Tyson to the board. That's his 2 children, Olivia Tyson and John R. Tyson. And Matt, you might remember John R. Tyson from such #1 hits as pleading guilty to a charge of driving while impaired and...
Oh, I love that. I play that on repeat.
And public intoxication and criminal trespassing after he was found stripped down to his boxer shorts and sleeping in a stranger's bed. And finally, his sleeper hit called I Lost My Job Last Year as CFO Because I'm a Criminal. So John R. Daddy appointed... John... this is hard to keep straight. John H. appointed his son, John R., to immediately serve on the Strategy and Acquisitions Committee and the Technology Committee, which is good news here because if they were to have put him on the Governance and Nominating Committee, he would have been in charge of stuff like reviewing and recommending to the board of code of conduct, right? And identifying and evaluating and recommending individuals qualified to be directors of the company, which he clearly couldn't have appointed himself, right? I mean, because he's clearly not someone who should be recommended to the board. Despite all this, despite being part of the controlling family, a family worth billions of dollars, the Tyson children will be paid $315,000 annually like all other non-employee directors. Now, this is an important distinction because John R. Tyson, the son, it is still considered an employee of the company, and yet will receive the pay that the non-employee directors receive. Traditionally, Matt, employees of the company receive no pay for their service on the board.
That's because he's not actually an employee of the company.
But still
He's
considered
just
an employee
executive
of
director.
the company, unlike his sister, who's not considered an employee of the company.
Well, look, the fact is that John H. Tyson has 40% of the influence and Barbara Tyson has 33% of the influence. This is a dual-class company with family dictatorship, and there is no shareholder right to representation at this point. Because if we should briefly go over John R. Tyson's illustrious career that wasn't deviant and involved police in some way, it was graduates, becomes chief sustainability officer
Almost
at Tyson
immediately,
Foods, and then chief financial officer. He was the CFO.
Without degrees in finance, right? He had an MBA, I believe.
His understudy at Tyson Foods when he was the CFO had been with Tyson Foods for more than 20 years in the finance department and didn't get a shot because John H. put John R. in the role.
Yeah.
After the deviant behavior, he leaves the company only to not leave the company. So now he
months.
represents as a fiduciary. He couldn't do the job of finance at the company, so he's going to do the job of representing shareholders who finance the company.
Of overseeing management at the company, yeah. Yeah,
I
you
mean,
know, if Kohls was a perfect use case for the fact that investors are not paying attention to directors, Tyson Foods is the perfect use case for that controlled companies like this, like Meta Platforms, should not be considered public companies because the behavior is nuts, right? At a minimum, that dad appointed his son back to the board almost immediately is just a bad look. It just proves that this is a private company. They just do whatever the hell they want. They don't care. They don't care that almost every article now coming out is really just kind of embarrassed by this, making fun of this decision. I mean, this is, again, these are the actions of a private company, and this is a perfect use case of this.
It is a private company. And that's the way to think of it. Despite the fact that in 2020, or 2021, I think the New York City put a shareholder proposal to recapitalize one share, one vote, which got 20, basically 20% of the vote.
Which is high.
Which is very, very high, considering the fact that the Tyson family controls the vast majority of the vote, which means virtually every other shareholder thought this was a good idea. This is a private company because you do not have a say.
It begs the question, Matt, if all this had happened at Kohls, do you think they would have elected John R. Tyson? Do you think they would have, or do you think they actually would have voted him out?
Do you think actually, so they wouldn't have voted him out if ISS did the recommendations.
Right.
But do you think that they should actually, here's a thought. In order to invest in a private company, you have to meet a certain qualifications. You need to have, a certain amount of capital. You have a liquidity. There are like regulations about how rich you can be because private companies are inherently risky and non-liquid. This company is quote unquote liquid, but shouldn't it actually be not allowed to be on an index where a retail investor can own it because you don't actually own it? Shouldn't it be considered like a private company where only institutions who can do the individual research on this company and afford to take risks? If Tyson Foods stock went to zero tomorrow, there is nothing you can do about it.
No,
there's nothing that
Sell
an
your
investor.
shares.
There's no one you can. There's no one you can vote out. There's no way for you to actually make change. Arguably,
You have no voice.
John R. Tyson's historical record suggests we're not in for a nice smooth ride as a fiduciary.
Yeah.
So if you have no recourse, maybe it should not be investable for any retail investors.
This is one of the areas of, I call it like corporate governance 1.0, the pioneers of corporate governance. This is one of the areas that still to this day, 2025, I'm still surprised that there's not more pushback. I really only hear the pushback out of us. I don't get how we allow these companies with this structure to exist in public markets anymore. To your point, they completely eliminate the voice of shareholders. I thought the whole point of this shareholder revolution, or whatever you want to call it, that we're crediting people like Bob Monks for, which, no disrespect to Bob Monks, who passed away in the past few weeks, did great work, but these companies have no shareholder voice, so should not be considered as part of the public market, and there should be a loud voice against allowing them. And I'm always surprised that there's not more pushback against them. So there you go. Anyway, let me move on to a few other stories. About 12 days ago, May 3rd, in a story covered everywhere, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, Berkshire Hathaway CEO and Chair Warren Buffett decided he didn't want to be CEO anymore, so he handed the baton to Vice Chair Greg Abel. So that succession plan finally happening. That's been in the works for about 400 years. The Trump 2.0 administration is stealing 2 more directors from the Free Flow Analytics database. It seems to me, Matt, that Trump 2.0 is mostly just people from our database, but here are the 2 that happened this week. Fiserv CEO and Chair Frank Bisignano has been confirmed as the commissioner of the Social Security Administration, and FedEx lead independent director David Steiner is the new United States Postmaster General. That feels like a conflict of interest. Speaking of conflict of interest, Steiner is the perfect brand of Trump 2.0 executive, as he was somehow called the lead independent director at FedEx, despite having served on the board for 16 years and amassing $15 million of company stock. So really not independent at all. So perfect for
Also,
Trump.
we're saying that is another dual class company. Fred Smith runs that company,
True.
Which means he's going to be perfectly happy with the dictator as a boss. That's not a problem.
Moving over to egregious pay, we've been covering these all proxy season. New Entegris CEO David Reeder starts with $400,000 in cash and $11 million in equity before even making a single decision other than, yes, I'll take the job. Likewise, Western Digital's new CFO Chris Senesial starts with $2 million in cash and $10 million in equity. And then how about this one at MGM Resorts? CEO William Hornbuckle gets a special one-time cash bonus of $8 million merely for continuing to do his job as he signs a new employment agreement. So I guess the old agreement was, $8 million short? So that's why he had to come up with a new agreement?
He was doing his job, but they wanted to do his job more.
Despite the fact that the agreement that was replaced actually expired in 2026, there's actually no reason in 2025 to rewrite that agreement other than to funnel some cash at him.
I don't mind these per se. If we treated these people like athletes, you would re-up an athlete's contract a year early if you thought we want a long-term contract in place where we can have this player because we love them, they're great for our brand, they're great for our performance, whatever. But there are measurables around that. Give me a measurable about William Hornbuckle that suggests that guy should stick around, that he's worth another $8 million for a longer-term contract.
And lastly, in our top stories, in a trend that we've been following closely called the down to 2 uninfluential women on the board trend of 2025.
It's got catchy name. It's a catchy name.
Something I'm seeing as a kind of a quiet anti-DEI policy that's been going on in corporate America. Layla Sturdy steps down at UiPath, leaving only 2 women on the board with a combined influence of 2%. And remember, this is notable because for the most part, large cap companies had a minimum, really for the last 10 years, maybe 15 years, of a minimum of 3 women on the board. But this is, they're not really paying attention to that benchmark anymore. They're just kind of quietly, and I'm not saying that they're kicking out the women. I'm saying that the women are resigning and they're not replacing them. They just don't really care about that policy anymore.
We're also seeing dilution where they add members to the board and they add largely more men than women. So you're winning on both fronts.
Let's move over to our proxy cage matches. The big match this week is between Phillips 66 and Elliott Investment Management. In a nutshell, Elliott has nominated 4 directors, wants to split the CEO chair role, and wants to get rid of classified board elections. They want annual director elections. This week, 3 proxy advisors who represent over 70% of institutional votes weighed in on the May 21st meeting. ISS and Egan-Jones are saying yes to all 4 Elliott nominees. ISS said the nominees would dismantle Phillips' culture of complacency, and that Phillips CEO Mark Lashier's dual role as chair represents a disconnect from shareholders. Before I go on, Matt, I don't know why ISS isn't screaming about every
single one.
Right?
Why is it here, but not everywhere else?
And I'd also like to kind of know how it quantifies a culture of complacency. I'm happy with the term. I just kind of want to know how they get to that conclusion. But all this to point out that Glass Lewis, on the other hand, is saying yes to the men, but not the woman. And look, I'm not saying this is a gender thing, but it's just how it happens to be. The Glass Lewis is saying no to Stacy Newwoat, a former senior energy and industrials analyst at Citadel. Glass Lewis, if you're listening, I don't know if that's really necessary to single out the woman in this fight. I mean, just I don't know. Is it really not necessary? I mean, do you really have proof that the three other people are going to do such a good job, but she's not going to do a good job? I don't know. I don't, optics wise, just what I don't know. I don't know what Glass Lewis is doing. But I wanted to point that out. Phillips 66 is arguing that Elliott should back down from its fight to break up the energy company because the activist investor is conflicted from a separate effort to acquire one of Phillips 66's rivals, Citgo Petroleum. Now, Citgo suitor Amber Energy is led by oil man Greg Goff, who we've talked about several times on these shows. Greg Goff revealed on April 9th that he bought $10 million in Phillips 66 shares and was backing Elliott's campaign. Phillips 66 has called this a conflict concerning because Amber Energy's executives are actively helping support Elliott's case to undermine Phillips 66's strategy. This is a big one. This is a weird one. This one gets a lot of headlines for some reason.
It's not that weird though, because so you're talking about a culture of complacency. This is a board where we have in our data 19 loops between the directors, and that covers basically the entire board. This is a large cap, mature U.S. company, and these are names that if you follow board members, if you follow the people, like you follow athletes, you'll recognize some of the names. There's Glenn Tilton. There's Charles Hawley, Denise Ramos. These are Greg Hayes of RTX. These are board members who not only sit on Phillips 66, but have been on other boards considered complacent to, when dealing with investors. The real question here is ISS. Why in this case are they complacent and the board chair combination is bad?
Because an activist is knocking on the door. That's why.
But we could name easily off the top of our head 50 U.S. companies that are exactly the same by those metrics, which means
Only
you're not
50.
doing any due diligence unless Elliott does it for you.
Yeah, it's
no
strange.
one's doing it.
I don't get that part of ISS's policies. I don't get why they can't. And if they have, they must have some formula where they're branding boards complacent and where they're saying that the new directors will work. So I don't know why they can't apply. They can't apply that to scale to the other companies they cover.
I think the formula is Elliott plus says so equals vote out. That's all it is.
And I repeat, I feel like every week on this show, ISS, if you need data to support your arguments, whether you are for or against directors at publicly traded companies, reach out to Free Float Analytics, and they will give you the data to help support your arguments.
It's true.
Let's move over to our vote results table. Here are the highlights from 89 large cap annual meetings over the past week. We're really in the middle of the proxy season now. We keep hearing so much about shareholder proposals, how the shareholders are taking down corporate America, right? They're the I don't know what they are. They're the socialist wing of the ESG party. But Matt, overall, out of the 89 meetings, there were only a total of 54 proposals. That's it, 54, and they only come from 41 companies. So that means that 48 of these companies had nothing, not a single proposal. In fact, nearly half of the meetings I looked at, nothing happened. There were no shareholder proposals, and there was no shareholder dissent, meaning no directors really had anything above 10%. There were no votes against pay or nothing, just nothing really going on. So anyway, yeah.
Also worth saying that shareholder proposals are voluntary. They don't have to listen to them. They're non-binding proposals.
Non-binding votes.
So, I know we want to crow about victories. I mean, I've been talking to a lot of shareholders who are discussing this sort of anti-DEI or anti-ESG shareholder proposals, the rise of them, and they're very happy about the fact that they're getting very little shareholder support. Meanwhile, the percentage of shareholder proposals that have passed in the past 10 years is 4%. So should we be gloating about, those shareholder proposals aren't winning when almost none really win? It's rare when one wins.
So let's look at the highlights from these 89 meetings. First of all, let's look at the wins that we referred to. Really, there are 6 wins, but maybe it's really 5 because at IDEX Laboratories, there was a vote for annual election of directors. And since the board had no recommendation, that usually means a win. I don't know why that's the case. I guess maybe proxy advisories set their votes that way. If the board doesn't recommend,
that's a good question.
Yeah,
auto vote. Yeah,
I guess because it's 92% supported that at IDEX Laboratories. And then there were 5 other victories. They're really governance victories. Simple majority vote, shareholders' ability to call a special meeting. Those occurred at companies like LKQ and ICU Medical. But here's a surprising one. This one floored me, and I guess there's a new trend going on this year. I don't know if this is a reaction to Trump 2.0. I have no idea. We'll see if this continues to evolve. And by the way, I think, Matt, the only winner anymore is John Chevedden. He seems to be the only one who puts up a winning proposal. But there were 2, both in the transparency in political spending at Teradyne and Cboe Global Markets. They both got more than 50% of support. I'm just surprised. I'm not. And I'll tell you for one simple reason.
So when I looked at the data this year so far, everyone's talking about the sort of changing political environment, what it means for shareholder votes. What if you actually look at Trump 1.0, there was a dip in any support for most, what you would consider woke shareholder proposals. During Biden, it goes up, and during Trump 2.0, it goes down. The exception to that rule at almost every single time is driven by the proponent, in this case, John Chevedden. His proposals are the only ones out of all. I think I have a database now of Fortune 250 companies that I use Proxy Monitor to get some data and MSCI to get some data. Really, the S&P 500 roughly of data. He's the only one who routinely gets 30% on average for his votes. It's driven by him. I think he could put a proposal up asking for largely anything, and he would get 30% of the vote in favor, because I think it's a proponent-driven model where now we're not voting on the substance of the shareholder proposal. We trust the proponent, and Chevedden's been around for so long. He's a gadfly. We know what he's about. It's almost always G-related. It's very practical, and I think that's what's winning. That's what's winning votes.
Case in point, I got 20 moral victories to point out. I'm not going to go over all of them, but I call a moral victory anything over 30%. Remember, I pointed out several times that 30% is the threshold, which is considered the effective control over a company. So if you control 30% of shares, you control the company. This is the figure used in companies like MSCI. I'm looking at the internet right now. It says 30% is often enough for control because it's usually more than anyone else has. And in a fragmented shareholder base, it's enough to steer or block major decisions. This is why we at Free Float call for, if you get 30% threshold on a shareholder vote, that should be considered a victory. This 50% thing is hogwash. But here are 20 moral victories. The one that stood out to me, speaking of John Chevedden, is shareholder approval on excessive golden parachutes. This is getting a lot love this year at companies like Illinois Toolworks, T. Price Rowe, Lockheed Martin, all above 30%. And you see some of the old favorites like independent board chair at Prudential Financial, shareholders' ability to call a special meeting at Prologis. And again, these are all John Chevedden's, and I'm calling these victories. But a couple of oddities I wanted to point out. First, another political spending one at Cadence Design got 44%. But to your point, Matt, they're really supporting, I guess, John Chevedden, and maybe in Trump 2.0, they're a little extra angry. But how about this one? This one surprised me. At Gilead Sciences, a shareholder proposal requesting a comprehensive human rights policy and human rights due diligence process somehow managed to get 36% support.
Ooh.
I have no idea why, other than the fact that I looked into it. This was put up by the Sisters of Mercy of the Americas, and I'm thinking, hey, this vote happened like a week or two after the Pope died. Matt, do you think there's like a flood of Catholic love that went to this vote? Because we never see human rights policies getting 36% of support. That one floored me. I don't know how that happened.
I mean, that one's weird.
Pope push?
Because the major holders of Gilead are Vanguard, BlackRock, State Street, Fidelity. It's all.
Right?
I mean, like,
don't care about
seem
human
anything
rights.
different.
Yeah, I don't. Again, I love the erratic patterns of shareholder votes. We also had a handful of, I'm calling shareholder disconnects. That's where essentially there's a high vote against pay, but there's no vote against the directors. One of the ones that I'm really looking at this week was S&P Global, where there's a 31% no on pay, but all directors received at least 95% support. So why? Who do you think is creating these policies that you're angry about? But anyway, there was like seven of those that follow the same pattern. Let's look at directors, Matt. No one's been really close to being voted out so far this proxy season at a large cap. This week, there were 2% of about 900 directors even received just over 20%, but no one over 50. The loser this week, I guess, was at CME Group. The nominating committee chair, Phyllis Lockett, she received 41% votes against. I don't know why. We have a very astute listener who reaches out to us, and he seems to have a good grasp on why some of these votes happen. So if you're listening, reach out to us again. Why did Phyllis Lockett get 41% against the CME Group?
If memory serves, CME board is one of those incredibly weird boards with sort of two voting blocks. One is they're like competing voting blocks, and I think they have 22 directors or something like that.
Big board, yeah.
It's a giant board, and the vast majority of the board has been there since like 1995. I mean, some of these people have been sticking around for 20 years. It's a very strange board, and I think every single year they get whoever's up in the class just gets votes against from themselves in a weird way. That's my memory of CME.
Finally, let me end with some oddities. I'm always looking for trends with all these stupid votes. How about this one, Matt? Auditor dissent? Votes against the independent auditor, which we never see. But I found 5 companies this week: Edwards Life Sciences, Ecolab, Service Corp, IDEX Corp, Stryker, where all of them had at least 10% votes against the auditor. What the heck? What could be happening? You just don't see this.
I mean, do you think you have to fire the auditor at a 10% vote against?
Absolutely. That's a
really high vote against.
Massive. So if anyone knows about this, please reach out to us, because this is a trend I just don't ever see. And finally, I want to point out this one. This one I hate. I'm putting this in the bullshit category. This is where the company requires the vote of 80% of outstanding shares to pass something. This happened at 2 companies this week: Eli Lilly and AbbVie, where they were trying to get shareholders to eliminate supermajority voting at both of them, and also classified board structure at Eli Lilly. The one that really stands out is AbbVie, where 99% of the vote said yes, they want to eliminate supermajority voting, but because it's under the threshold, which requires 80% of outstanding shares, it doesn't pass. I mean, come on, this is just
how many shares did they
nonsense.
get? Did they actually say?
I can look into that and report back next week, but no, but again, I mean, what are we playing at here?
I mean, by all accounts, a lot of times when it's set that way, it's like 77% of the shares voted.
Right. No, it's an impossible structure to overcome. So yeah, that's it. That's again, I got a lot more data, a lot more stories with all these meetings. So if you are interested and you're a listener, reach out if you want any more details or you want the list. But that's it for me, Matt, which is enough. I'm going to hand it over to you on the big vote. We have a lot of, again, there are several major companies up for a vote next week, including the giants like Amazon.com, JP Morgan Chase, McDonald's. But what are you focusing on this week?
All right, this week, because there's so many big companies, there are about 20 companies with 50 billion in market, U.S. companies with 50 billion in market cap or more that are just coming up for a vote in the next week. And because of that, I thought, well, how do you even sort? Let's say you're, a pension fund with a team of one or two, maybe stewardship people. How do you sort what's important to vote? Which directors to vote against, which to vote for? There's so much going on all at the same time. How do you do this? So my goal here was actually to take all 20 of them as a case study and say, how would I narrow in on just the outliers? How would I figure out which of these companies is the one worth focusing on? Not to say that there's not directors on all of them worth focusing on. I mean, I can name the directors at McDonald's that should be voted out everywhere because they're sort of like the protected class of director. But forget that. Let's just say, give me some outliers. Okay. So here's what I looked at. First, I looked at the market returns. I looked at 1 year and 5 year TSR. Just really simply versus the S&P 500. These are blue chip, old school U.S. companies for the most part. Only JP Morgan, McDonald's, ServiceNow, and Schwab beat the S&P 500 in the 1 year. And JPM, the Southern company, no, sorry, the other one.
Copper.
Yeah, Copper. Southern Copper Company, which I get both of them confused. ServiceNow, EOG Resources, and Schwab beat in the 5 year TSR versus the S&P 500. So you're talking about out of the 20, only 5 actually beat the S&P 500, and only 3 of them beat the S&P 500 in the 1 and the 5 year. So this is fair game. If you are an investor, 5 years is, for all intents and purposes, long-term as an investor. You did not get long-term returns aligned with the S&P 500 from the vast majority of these companies. You might as well say, like, okay, it's open season.
Right. In fact,
we can vote against anyone.
In fact, at mid caps and small caps, this is the routine behavior that when companies underperform in this way, the investors actually do target the directors at a much more frequent rate.
So at this point, that leaves you with the people. That leaves you with, okay, if all of these directors, of which there are 220-ish of them, are up for grabs, then how do I focus on a board that's underperforming? Because there's so many that are underperforming. So what I did was I actually looked at the director. I just did straight performance first and foremost. I said, give me every director that has underperformed on TSR plus one other thing.
Okay.
Meaning TSR in earnings, carbon, or controversies. And then I said, give me all the directors that have underperformed on any 2 things. So it could be earnings and controversies, right? And then show me the boards that have the highest percentage of those underperforming directors on them. This is very, very simple way to sort of narrow down to where am I getting my worst performance? And bearing in mind that these directors at these companies are largely, the average number of boards they sit on are 2 or more. They are on boards for years upon years, often decades across multiple boards. These are professional directors, the vast majority of them, right? only one company stood at the top as having the highest concentration of underperforming board members and highly interconnected sort of insular board when we looked at our connections data. And it was Verizon.
Yes.
So let's talk about Verizon. Here are the easy wins. There's 11 members of this board, including Hans Vestberg, who's the CEO, who we featured last week on BlackRock, right? Here's some easy wins. So I've already narrowed it down to one company to focus on, simply using a bunch of filtered data about directors. And now I'm going to, when you dive into the easy wins, this is easy filtering wins. I did not have to even open the proxy for this data. Okay. Dan Schulman and Laxman Narasimhan. Laxman, ex-CEO of Starbucks.
Yeah.
They are
CEO of Starbucks. Yeah.
They are connected to 64% of the Verizon board.
Wow.
Almost 2/3 of the board they are connected to through either board interlocks or nonprofit interlocks. This is like a deep fist bump board. These are directors who all have friends in common. And 64% is an incredibly high percentage, even for companies in the U.S. large cap space. So easy targets, right? Do I want two directors who know 2/3 of the board or have friends in common with 2/3 of the board? How about Roxanne Austin?
Oh, who's I know that name. Yeah.
You know that name because she's on 4 boards currently. She's 4 active boards. She's the chair of the audit committee at Verizon. And I'm glad you brought up the auditor sort of pushback. Mm-hmm. I want to do a little bit of inside intel because the audit committee, I've been talking to some directors, which is something I don't particularly like doing. But I talked to some, and in almost every conversation, the directors themselves say the audit committee takes by far the most time on the board. It is the biggest time suck. It's the most time consuming. They have 2 to 3 times as many meetings as the rest of the board, and their board book, they get the normal board book, which is like, 100 pages, and they have another 100 to 200 pages of financials in their book.
I remember you pointed this out last week about BlackRock, and we were talking about Hans Vestberg, and it struck me that this guy is the CEO of Verizon, and he's also on the audit committee at BlackRock, where they had 15 meetings last year. This is a busy guy. I mean, if you're a BlackRock shareholder, I'm thinking, this guy's too busy to do all this work.
Well, it gets worse, okay? Because this committee is by far, while they're by far the most informed about financials, they are by far the most time constrained.
Sure.
And they're not actually that necessarily that influential when it comes to long-term strategy. They're kind of the nerds, right? Like it's not necessarily that you're listening to these people because they're influential. They just know the most about the numbers. But here's a startling
risk. Yeah, go ahead.
Here's a startling high-level piece of data. In the U.S., there are 9,970 audit committee members right now. That's chairs plus members, right? 1,113 of them, 11% of them, are on more than one audit committee on a publicly traded board in just the U.S.
Okay.
That's multiple boards.
How do they keep those numbers straight? Yeah.
11%. So 1 in 10 audit committee members is sitting on another audit committee somewhere.
Right. Yeah.
Shockingly, shocking to me, there are 11 directors in our database who are on 4 audit committees.
That can't be real. Really?
4 separate audit committees.
I would like to. Yeah, are they geniuses? I would like to see them figure out how to keep all those numbers separate in their heads.
Imagine if you are on 4 separate audit committees, and the average number of audit committee meetings that I could tell were about 11 per year across the U.S. Right? And let's say that's 44 audit committee meetings that you have to go to if you're on 4 of them. And let's say that every one of those audit committee meetings comes out with 300 pages of data. That's 3,300 pages of financial data times 44 meetings.
Jeez.
What kind of time do you have? That's like reading a J.K. Rowling book, like 2 a day. That's an insane amount of time.
Yeah.
Of those those members who are on multiple boards, 263, 23% of directors who are on audit committees on multiple boards, they're on audit committees with the same auditor as another board that they're on.
Wow.
This gets to your audit committee, your auditor pushback, right?
Yeah.
These are people who are effectively, you're on the board of ABC company, your PricewaterhouseCoopers does the audit, and you're on the, XYZ company, and PricewaterhouseCoopers does their audit. Guess who's on that list? Roxanne Austin of Verizon.
Wow.
She's on the board.
Four audit committees.
She's on AbbVie, CrowdStrike, and Verizon Audit Committee. She's the chair of 2 of them, and EY is the auditor at both Verizon and AbbVie. She's chairing Verizon and CrowdStrike. How much time does Roxanne Austin have exactly?
I haven't. I'm just learning this, so I haven't had time to dig into what else she does. She's also the lead independent director at AbbVie and something called Freshworks. I mean, she's not just on the audit committee, Matt. I mean, and not to mention she's the CEO of her own investment advisor company.
That's right, Austin Investment Advisors, which
is just too much. This is ridiculous.
I mean, what is the expectation for her? I mean, she can show up to every single meeting, but how can you possibly? So what ends up happening inevitably is you only have the space in your head to make the sort of global decision. So let's say you're talking about tariffs, right? You come to a conclusion about like how tariffs are going to matter to businesses. You take it to all of those companies because there's no way for you to in a nuanced way. And we know this. When I look at this big data, I can't just look at the big data and do nothing else. I mean, I could, but the best information is when you do it and then do some research on top of that to figure out what is the nuance in this company. You can't possibly do that. If you're on 3 separate audit committees, you're chairing 2 of them, you're the lead independent director somewhere else, and you run your own company. These are like Musk-like numbers. That's
impressive.
It's just insane amount of business you're doing. But you want to know who else on Verizon is on multiple audit committees? 2 of the Verizon audit members, Clarence Otis and Shelley Archambault.
Okay.
So there are 4 people on the audit committee at Verizon. 3 of them sit on multiple audit committees at multiple publicly traded boards.
Wow.
So, and Clarence Otis actually just finished being the lead independent director at Verizon. He's been on the board for 19 years.
Yeah.
And he handed off lead independent director to Dan Schulman, who I mentioned as one of the most connected people on this board. Which brings us to our arguably one of our last layups here, which is CEO Vestberg. And we covered him on BlackRock as, here's my own quote. Vestberg, quote, flatly underperforms. Verizon's board has returned to 388 in TSR as a group, 264 in controversies. This is a deeply underperforming board with 0 directors batting above 500 on TSR or controversies, despite 2 of the directors being on just the Verizon board. This is a pattern and it's consistent. 70% of the Verizon board members have a background in economics and only 40% have communications backgrounds. Included in the 70% with economics backgrounds are Dan Schulman, Hans Vestberg, Clarence Otis, Laxman Narasimhan, and Roxanne Austin.
Yeah, just an unfortunate overlap of skills.
And then if we look at just pure performance, just who underperforms? The worst performer is Vittorio Coleo. The second worst is Laxman Narasimhan. And Clarence Otis is actually the most expensive. He costs Verizon. There's a new ratio I like
this. I like this.
I looked at for every 0.001 of batting average you get, how much did it cost you in terms of paying that director and realized pay? Clarence Otis cost $508 per 001 of TSR.
Okay.
And he underperformed on TSR. So you're overpaying for underperformance. So wrapping it up.
Yeah.
There is a case. There are so many easy layups here. There's a case to be made that you could vote most of this board out, almost the entire board.
Yeah.
Right? But your layups are vote no on Clarence Otis, vote no on Roxanne Austin. She's got plenty to do.
Give her a break.
She'll not
be happy.
worry.
She needs a break.
She could use the break. She'll be fine. Vote no on Dan Schulman and Laxman Narasimhan.
What about Hans?
And then your alternate vote no is Hans Vestberg.
I got to tell you, Hans, as the chair and the CEO, it's too much. What did ISS call that?
Oh yeah, they really don't like it now.
They had a term. I already forgot.
Said it's a disconnect from shareholders. That's
right.
What they
so
said.
At a board like this, Verizon will be fine with a board overseeing management where the management is not control the agenda. So I say vote out Hans too. That's my vote.
And look, when you do this vote, I know it feels icky to vote out. 5 members on 11 vote no on 5 members on an 11-person board. You are making slots for 5 new people to change the board culture from one that is overbusy, overtired, insular, and underperforming to one that is future-looking, future-forward, better knowledge types.
I was going to say, not to mention that,
more strategic.
We have a backlog in backgrounds in economics, which is not, a few is fine, but maybe not appropriate for Verizon Communications.
And top this off with the fact that your ability to engage with these companies and do shareholder proposals in this administration with this SEC, you have data to back up voting no on these directors. This isn't personal. It isn't about this is a strictly data-driven approach to saying, well, you know what? We are limited in a lot of ways in what we can do, but we can look at the data and we can vote no on some directors.
Anything else, Matt?
That's it.
That's the proxy countdown for the week of May 12th, 2025. Join us next week when we jump back into the alternative democracy pool. Forever on the lookout for shareholder shenanigans, dopey directors, scandalous CEO pay ratios, and wayward band-aids.